Okay, good morning, everyone. We got the green signal. Let us start. Let me start with a quote. We cannot become equal members in your society. We can become a member in a new society where everyone chooses to share, but that cannot happen until you begin to reconsider and reformulate your understanding and your view of the world as we have begun to reformulate us. Words from the Fourth World, written by Chief George Manuel. So, a warm welcome to the second day of International Virtual Conference on the topic The Fourth World, organized by Nesamudi Memorial Christian College, Marthandam, Kanyakumari, in collaboration with Cape Comorin Trust, India. I thank the correspondent, principal, the head of the department, faculty members from Nesamudi Memorial Christian College, and Cape Comorin Trust President for creating such a wonderful platform to discuss the much needed content in this particular contemporary era. By the way, this is Asbin Monohar, going to be the moderator for this session today. There was an era. Literary people gave more importance to epics, supreme words, vast setting, superhuman heroes, aristocratic warriors, but things have changed now. People started realizing the ground reality. We started focusing on the marginalized and exploited. Who are these marginalized? They are the natives who are cornered in their own land and called uncivilized. I believe this session is going to be one of the scintillations on track where we, the third world people, are focusing on the fourth world people or natives to come on lights. So without taking much time, let us get into the business. I would like to call Dr. Bhumika Sharma for the preliminary one. I'll just give an introduction. Give me a short span of time. So regarding Dr. Bhumika Sharma is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Central University of Rajasthan, India, a double postgraduate with masters in English and economics from the University of Rajasthan. She holds doctorate in English. Her research interests include Indian English literature, gender studies, post-colonial literature, and African American writing. She has authored the book, The African American Journey of the Pardo, Wright, Ellison, Baldwin, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing, London, and co-authored two books titled The Sense of Being, an exploration of immateriality in matter and the logic of consciousness. Understanding the evaluation of sense, she has also co-edited a book disclosing a minority in text and co-text. Besides books, she has around 35 publications as research articles and book chapters in various anthologies of national and international repute, including Indian literature, published by Sahitya Academy, Journal of African American Studies, published by Springer, USA, and Epiphany, Journal of Transdisciplinary Studies, published by International University of Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has delivered invited talks and presented papers in around 60 conferences. That includes her presentation in American Comparative Literature Association Congress 2016 at Harvard University, USA, the 12th International Comparative Literature Association Congress 2019 at University of Macau. Mike is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Espin, for your kind words. And it's really my privilege to be the part of this conference, which is so relevant and I think we all understand its significance in the contemporary time. Today, I'm going to talk more about the theory of the protest literature. So definitely, I'm very much sure that the people and other presenters must have talked about the literature that is coming directly from the fourth world. But I would like to just throw some light on how this protest element as a very strong component of the literature came up, and how the voices from the marginalized, which may be in terms of nationalities, or in terms of social categories, or in terms of ethnicity, or even in terms of perhaps location, how these marginalized voices gradually start coming and then assimilating in the mainstream literature. So they might have started as a sub-stream, but then they occupied very, very, you can say, prominent position in the mainstream itself. So that way, my talk is going to be a little bit theoretical, and of course, it would also be dealing with the practical dimension of it, that how this protest element is practiced in literature. So I would like to share my presentation. I hope the admin will allow me for that.
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Yeah, I'll go for the full screen view if it does not pose any problem. Yeah, is it visible? I hope.
Yes, it is.
Okay, fine. So, as you know, that my talk is titled "Protest Literature: Theory and Practice." I would like to begin with this quote by Rudolf Weinberg, who was a very famous German journalist. He stated, "Prose is a weapon, and we have to sharpen it." So this statement itself shows that how much force, how much energy, how much, you can say, power lies in the literature. And prose fiction is used. Prose fiction, because it's a kind of genre. We have epics, we have poetry, we have all other kinds of genres, all other kinds of forms. But then the prose fiction becomes instrumental in bringing the social change in the society. And that's why we can see that how the realistic literature gradually took shape, how the protest element started percolating into the realistic literature, and that became a kind of weapon for those intellectuals, for those literary artists, and for those scholars who were so enthusiastic about their cause. They wanted to speak on behalf of the marginalized, and that made this role as a strong weapon, and that had so much power that perhaps everybody acknowledged that. And so it has been stated that it has power, it has energy, it has force. We just need to sharpen it, because if it is sharpened, then it will definitely be more effective. So this protest element in the literature is basically a way to sharpen that prose, so that it can directly hit that part which need to be perhaps cured, which need to be opposed, which need to be rebelled against, and that makes the protest literature. So let's have a very simple discussion about what is protest literature, because when we try to define it, there are multiple meanings, there are multiple definitions that come to our mind. What is protest literature? Some people would say that it is basically the literature that speak from marginalized social position. Others would also like to bring the other aspect of it, that it is the literature that critiques the establishment, the already given up setup, which is hierarchical and which lead to the oppression of certain categories. And that's why basically protest literature is that literature which challenges that hierarchical pattern and challenges that status quo condition and wants to bring change. So that is the true spirit of protest literature, which flourished perhaps all across the globe. It's not like one literary tradition, let's say British tradition or American tradition or Russian literary tradition or so on and so forth. That gave space, that gave scope to the protest literature, but it was prevalent all across, because this was the literature, and this is the literature that speaks on behalf of the humanity, that combines, that binds, that unifies all the different sections of the society, which somewhere get oppressed or which are kept underprivileged because of this hierarchical pattern. So that is the spirit of protest literature. Now we can think about and just ponder over that what are the factors which are working behind. because that is a very, you can say, pervasive debate in the academic circle, because some of the scholars try to point out the historical incidences, certain events, certain social and political actions that lead to the birth of protest literature. But there are other scholars also, and I generally side with them when they say that protest literature arouses from the life itself, because it is the commitment to the life, it is the faithfulness to the life that inspired the writers to raise this voice of protest, to speak on behalf of marginalized. And it's not only on behalf of, now there are the sections, marginalized sections, and very prominent writers, very creative writers, very talented writers from these sections itself, and they do talk about that protest and the rebellion which is much needed in the society. So I'll just enumerate, briefly, that what could be the possible factors which work behind it. So generally it is related to the 19th century realistic school of writing, where the common man was brought at the center, and we, started having no more aristocratic heroes, no more royal families heroes, but we started having the common man, a person who is drawn from the common masses, who is connected with the common masses, and who can basically show you the heroic element of the common life itself. The everyday life is a challenge for them, and they are heroic enough to face those challenges, and that's why you can see that common person, that person drawn from the common masses, as a hero. So this way we find that this protest literature is very much connected with the realistic mode of writing that flourished in the 19th century. So some of the scholars said that perhaps it is industrialization and urbanization that led to this development. Others said that there was the emergence of socialist thought, because there were ideological changes, and people started, formulating new ideologies, and this emergence of social thought somewhere facilitated a new thinking which would be in favor of the oppressed class. So this emergence of social thought that spoke for the equality of everybody, of all, that perhaps, worked as an inspiration for the protest literature. Literary realism, as I've already told you, that is also connected with that. But if I see it in depth, then perhaps it is the compulsion of the life itself that arouses protest literature. So, what are the features of it that actually you can, make you help identify that this is protest literature? You can very conveniently say, "Oh, wow, that's great. There is some kind of the strong underlining of protest, and that is actually fulfilling the social cause." So basically this protest literature that started, gaining momentum from 19th century onwards, that made an objective very clear, that it wants to reveal the society's evil. It wanted to advocate certain type of social and political action, the reforms which were taking place. It wanted to oppose also certain types of action which were harming the particular section of the society. Beside that, it also had a role to play, and that's why what happened, that it assigns a role and purpose to the writing itself. So there may be these premises which we are familiar with, art for art's sake, that perhaps may have its own importance, but art for society's sake, that also has its own relevance, and that perhaps makes literature more significant in terms of social change. So this literature not only assigned a role and purpose to the writing, but it produced very rich social criticism that was required to correct the measures, to correct the ways in which certain things were happening in the society. And that became more and more forceful when these writers and those crusaders found it difficult to go ahead, to step ahead. So they expressed their radicalism to upturn the society, to have a new society, as Dr. Abhin has already pointed out, that this is a new social order that is coming up, and for that we need to reformulate ourselves, we need to rethink. So this radicalism somewhere compelled everybody to rethink and reformulate their thinking, so that they can understand what is wrong in the society, what is responsible for this self decay of the humanity, and why it is required to speak for the noble cause, to speak for the marginalized section. So this way we find numbers of issues and concerns which are pervasive in the protest literature. They are both local and global. So I'll just point out to give an idea, like it originated, at different locations, and that's why the center point, the focus arena was different depending upon the context. So there was protest literature that was directly addressing slavery. There was protest literature which came from the women's writer, and we could see that how they pointed out gender as a category of discrimination. Similarly, casteism that becomes so relevant in the context of Indian social setup, racism, ethnocentrism, all these things become the concern and the issues of the protest literature. So I would like to trace its origin and then gradual development over the years, in fact over the centuries. So we can see the protest literature in mainstream writings also. So even at the initial stage, when the fourth world was not in the picture, it was somewhere lost. It was completely missed out from the historiography of, let's say, the literary traditions and the mainstream history and the political history of the countries. It was there. There were writers who raised their voice, who spoke for uh, the downcast people. So that way we can have this streak of protest somewhere featuring even in the mainstream literature, whether it is British literature, where you could see Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, who were writing in the realistic mode and who were addressing the plight and predicament of a particular section, whether it is, the orphan like Oliver Twist, or it is David Copperfield, and maybe the poor class that is to be featured, because there were haves and have not, so that is to be brought out. So it was there in British literature, it was there in French literature, it was there in the German literature, Russian literature, American literature. So these are a few examples. You can read Emily Zola, Gustave Flaubert, and Guy de Maupassant, who is the master storyteller in French literary tradition. They all somewhere showed their concern with the social cause. They became critical of the wrong practices of the society. They tried to speak for the marginalized section of the society, and so on. I mean, there are so many examples. I'll just read it out. I'll not go into the detail because I would like to come to the the specific example that would perhaps help us to understand this streak of protest in literature. So these all are just named like Karl Bond and Heinrich Heine, social novels of Theodore Fontaine. All these writers somewhere committed to the protest element in literature. Similarly, in Russian literature, we have the names like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Ivan Turgenev, Nikolai Chernyavsky, What is to be done? That is a famous work. American literature, you can see Mark Twain, who is a classic writer, who somewhere in the Huckleberry Finn raised, this issue of the black and their life and their experiences. So this was just a streak. It was streak that was not so prominent. It was dim. But then after the span of time when the fourth world literature came, whether it is in the form of Dalit literature or African American writing, this element became more and more prominent and more forceful. So we would try to investigate into that, and so I'll just enumerate the example that perhaps would help us to understand it. So you could see that there are this streak of protest in the mainstream literature, but at the same time, there came the literature gradually from the marginalized locations, marginalized categories, marginalized nationalities, marginalized ethnic groups, and these are the voices from the marginalized. So Dalit literature, African American literature, Australian Aboriginal literature, they all are a very powerful example of that. That how the literature created by these writers belonging to specific communities, specific nations, specific location, a specific category, how their literature actually proved that prose is a weapon. And so the society was compelled to rethink and reformulate its understanding. So let's take up these literary illustrations, because see, in my 1 hour talk I cannot cover the entire scale because it's very vast. So I would like to just give the two example. One example from the Indian English literature, Burk Raj Anand, who is basically not a Dalit writer but who started speaking on behalf of Dalit. It has its own critique also, because some of the thinkers consider him as not sufficiently able to understand the Dalit experience, and I do agree with. But at the same time, we perhaps need to know that how, the efforts on the part of like certain mainstream writing, and that may be mainstream writing, but at the same time it was a marginalized location in terms of English literature. So India, which was colonized and was in the process of decolonization, it wanted to be politically independent, so in a way it was slightly marginalized in terms of the location, in terms of nationality. And there we find a writer who uh, who felt some sympathy about the about certain section of the society, and formulated a kind of literature which is of course visible in his novels like Kuli and The Untouchable. So he tried to speak. How far he succeeded, in speaking, that is a matter of again a critical debate. But at the same time, he proposed this theory of the protest literature to certain extent when in his essay Sources of Protest in My Literature he becomes very very straight, very straight, very evident in telling us that why does he prefer to call his literature protest literature. Because today I'm going to discuss more the theoretical dimension and the praxis, means the literary practice which is associated with that. That's why I'm taking up Murkraj Anand as an example, because I really find some kind of similarity in Murkraj Anand writing from a let's say colonized country like India, and then the later literature like African American literature, where we do have writers like Richard Wright as a stalwart in the protest writing. So this way we can see some kind of parallel, some kind of correspondence there at the level of theory. I'm not talking about the direct practice, although practice is also there, because these two writers somewhere gave very interesting fiction to read, and that somewhere opened the eyes of the society, and especially those sections which were so indifferent to the predicament of the downtrodden class. So these two examples drawn from the two different literary tradition, which basically is thinking about the building of the protest literature, about the theoretical dimension of the protest literature. I would like to bring together, at par, so that we can perhaps investigate more into what go uh, into like building of the protest literature. So you can see Indian English literature that addresses caste, and we can see African American literature that resists race, and all these two streams somewhere formulate the protest literature. So my, you can say the basic question or the foundational question is, what brings protest in literary expression? So that becomes the subject of critical debate, and there are different views. Some of the writers say that there is some kind of ideological orientation, and the writer cannot avoid it, because the writer somewhere gets affected by that ideological orientation, and perhaps believes into the assumptions which that ideology takes. And that's why there is some kind of abstract theory which lies behind the birth of protest literature. And this ideological orientation can be anything, like maybe the writer's commitment to the realism, or writer's commitment to the naturalism, or to the socialism, or to the communism. The communist thinking leads to talk about the class, and how it leads to the marginalization of the poor class. So that perhaps lies at the core of protest literature. So that is one point of view. But then there is another point of view which focuses more on the human situation. As I told you, that the sources of protest lies in the compulsion of life. When you observe and witness the wrong things happening around, being a writer, being a sensible soul, you cannot stop looking at it. You cannot stop thinking about it. You cannot resist speaking about it. So ultimately, it comes out in the form of an articulation, and that goes into the making of the protest. So it may be a kind of debate that whether it is ideological orientation, or maybe it is a desire for the truthful presentation of the life, writing about the human predicament, love and sympathy for the marginalized sections, or maybe the rebellious instinct, which is more prominent in the literature that is coming directly from the fourth world literature, at least to some extent. So you could see that this protest may be slightly mild in the mainstream literature, but that becomes more and more assertive in the other substreams of the literature. So that is the thing. And For that, perhaps, just to understand this dichotomy of whether it is an ideological orientation that leads to uh, make the protest or bring the protest in literature, or it is the human situation that compels the writer to bring protest in literature. I would like to quote Mulk Raj Anand, who said that this opposition of, let's say, the superior and inferior, that became an obsession with me long before I read Karl Marx. So Mukranand is very, very clear in making the statement that it was not the, you can say, the trigger of the communism or trigger of some kind of ideology that led me to think about the marginalized class. No, even before reading the Karl Marx, he was able to point out and witness this opposition between the superior and the inferior. So that lies somewhere in the sensibility of the writer itself. So when Mukranandan talks about the theoretical underlining of the protest literature, he says that writing protest means writing life. There is no theory behind it. There may be theory in certain contexts, but actually for him, because he was speaking from his own standpoint, and every writer has perhaps this freedom to speak for. So he makes very, very clear. I would just like to read out that particular extract that I really find so relevant here in terms of understanding the theory line behind this protest literature. He says, I made my first conscious protest as a writer when I came away from Bloomsbury after hearing the critic Edward Sackville West. So he was aware of all the debate, critical debate that was occurring in the academic circle. But then he was not bound with that, or he was not completely engrossed into that, because that was not the real life. What happened with him? He shares his own experience. He says, I was just then writing Untouchable. I left London and went to Gandhi's Sabarmati Ashram in 1927. There I learned some sincerity, truthfulness, and simplicity. And as the Mahatma sent me to the people, that becomes important here, because as a writer, he could understand the sentiments of the of other people, because society is the connection between the self and the other. You cannot live in isolation. There is a inter relationship that builds the society and strengthens the society. So when he shares his experience and tells us that Mahatma Gandhi, when asked him to go to the people, then he perhaps faced the real life. So the real life and the real life concerns and the whole purpose of his writing was not vested into the critical debate happening in the academic circle, but it was vested into his observation, his witnessing of the people and their predicament. And so he continues, before I should write any more novels, from that time onwards, my protest about the human predicaments under the empire and in the atmosphere of our own decay became self-conscious. So his connection to the people, his extension to the other people, which actually make them aware of the human predicament, that made them realize that what were the two major factors during that colonial period in India, which were responsible for the predicament of the common masses. So one was the empire, that is the colonial rule that was so oppressive, and the other was the self-decay, that is the faulty social system which was based on the gender discrimination, caste discrimination, and so on and so forth. Because even the poor people, they were also, you can say, they were not given the due which they perhaps always earned by giving their labor to the country. So that way he became self-conscious, and here lies the source of his protest. So he says, all experience then became the reservoir from which I wrote my fiction, hoping to transform. So this shows the purpose, this shows the objective, transform the raw materials of life freely into communicable form. So he actually, drew the material of his writing from the materiality of the life, from the experiences of the people. That was the raw material for his writing, and that he wanted to communicate so that the voice can be heard. So that was basically his understanding of the protest literature, which he wrote. So he made it very, very clear that what are the sources of protest in his fiction. So one is the colonial empire, definitely, but the other, which he very specifically pointed out, is the self-decay of the Indian social setup. And so his fiction somewhere generated the critique of the caste, class, and gender discrimination. So the protest begins with the identification of the existing social categories, because till the time these categories exist, it is fine, because everyone is not same. We all have our own different talents, our different capabilities and all. So having social categories perhaps maybe something natural. For example, we have biological categories also, like male and female, but bringing the power into the relationship to of those categories, bringing the authority, bringing the subordination, bringing the hierarchical setup, while configuring these social categories to make the social setup, that is wrong. So this misuse of the power, abuse of the power, somewhere defining the interrelationship of the categories in that way through the power, that makes something wrong with this kind of categorization. So he in his literature tried to identify these categories, and so we can see that he makes a very clear statement himself when he refers to that how as a child he became aware of the surrounding, how he could see that the women are oppressed, he could see how the poor are looked down upon, how his parents would forbid him to play with the poor people, those who are living in a particular section of the society, a particular apartments also where which were allotted to them. So that way he started identifying gender. And it's not only Mulkraj Anand, it goes for all self-conscious writers, that they devote themselves, they commit themselves to the keen observation, the acute observation of their surrounding, and then they identify what is problematic into the social setup, what is problematic into the surrounding. So he wrote, I sense the pain of life, which the more privileged took out of the weaker members of the flock. I knew the patriarchs who enslaved women. So that was one observation that made him conscious of the present and the existing gender categories, and then the gender categories becoming oppressive for particular gender. So he wrote that this is how the patriarchs would enslave women by imposing conventions which curtail their freedom behind the prison of parda or semi parda. So this is just an example that how he started identifying the gender as a social category by observing his surroundings. Similarly, he identified class also, because no one could stop noticing what is happening their time if he or she is true to oneself. So he says, I noticed that among my playmates were boys and girls who were considered superior if they were the children of parents in big house, and inferior if they were the children of parents in small shabby hutmen. So that way, it became, this classification became very, very clear. And so a child who is self-conscious, who has some kind of literary sensibility, who has some sympathy for the other, for person, for the human, without thinking of any category here intervening it, so can observe it, that how the categories do exist in the society. Similarly, he identifies class. And our parents ask us to have a bath after playing with children from the hutments, because we may have touched untouchable. I early realized that as we were of Kshatriya caste, we were superior, with Brahmins above us and Vaishya shopkeepers slightly inferior to us, and all outcasts far, far below us. So, just observing life, a writer can identify these categories and can understand its problematic. He need not to go to any theory or any ideological framework to look this reality of the life. So that way, if we again reconsider the question, what goes in making of protest in fiction, I would be very pointed in responding to this question, that what goes in making the protest in fiction, your faithfulness to the life, your faithfulness to the social reality. And then as a writer, when you actually think to create a character who could speak for the marginalized, could speak for the oppressed, the suppressed, the repressed, then perhaps your literature gets uh, a kind of force which becomes irresistible. So he writes here, I wish to recreate the folk whom I knew intimately. So he need not to go any theory to create the characters in his work, but he just wanted to draw the people, the heroes from the common masses, and then he wanted to recreate them in a literary figure. So he says that he wanted to recreate these characters from the lower depths, the lumpins and the suppressed and the oppressed, repressed, those who had seldom appeared in our literature, because there was the literature which was basically for the consumption of the elite class, and that elite class was not very much interested in reading about that. And there were writers who were catering to the need of that particular class. But then there was writing coming from the other section also, from the Sarat Chatterjee, Prem Chand, Vibhuti, Tara Shankar Manik Banerjee. So this was the kind of writing which was more sensitive to the existing categories, existing social categories in the Indian social setup, and it wanted to draw attention of the reader to this social reality. So that way, protest literature emerges. It emerges out of the real life, and then it changes the equations. It actually brings the margin to the center. So what happens here, that the downcast is placed at the center so that the world can look at the things from the perspective of that downcast, which was marginalized, by then. So basically, protest literature is identifying that heroic which lies in the commonplace. It is critiquing the cruelty of the suppression. It is basically addressing the ironies of the real life. That really sounds very ironical, very funny, that God, like generally it is stated that God has created all equal, but there are some more equal than the others. So this kind of equations which are human beings created. I'm not using the word man because I don't want to be just gender specific. So basically, we have created these kind of categorization and then brought power into that to justify our, you can say, our actions. That why do we suppress, why do we have slavery, why do we have gender discrimination? So we may weave multiple arguments to justify that, but in any case, the oppression of one class by the other or one section by the other can never be justified, because this is an irony of the life, and that is brought out by the writers who dedicate themselves to the protest literature. So you can see the resistance that becomes the factor, the core element of the protest expression in literature, and then how it comes out in the form of a response. So I'll just read it out, that the cruelty of this god-made order came home to me when Baka, a sweeper boy, brought me home bruised in the head by an accidental stone. My mother abused him for carrying me and touching me, and she bathed me even though I was bleeding. This little incident was to remain in my consciousness, unconscious, and became a passion for justice against the old fixtures of non-human discrimination against untouchables. And this passion became the protest implicit in my first published novel, Untouchable, which has been called the prototype of the protest literature. So we have, a very large critique that, of course, is built around Mulk Raj Anand writing, and then the Dalit writers coming up straightforward. And that is wonderful to have the writers coming from that section who can, who don't need anyone to speak on their behalf, who themselves can speak for them. But of course, because here, as I am more focusing on the theoretical dimension of it, so that's why I brought this example here. Now, as I said, that protest is aroused out of life. It is basically lying in the compression of life, instead of any kind of ideological orientation or any kind of abstract theory. We need to understand it's another dimension also, that how protest is seen. It is seen into multiple response in multiple frame, and there is one way of looking at it, that protest is also seen as a response to the violence, because violence is of different types. It's not just physical. It may be emotional, it may be psychological, it may be intellectual, it may be epistemological, it may be environmental, and so on. So there are varieties of the violence, and so we need a voice that perhaps can respond to this violence, whether it is in the mainstream writing or in the substream writing, or maybe no mainstream and substream. It is literature itself, generic literature which does not categorizes writings as such. So here, I'll just finish with this quote regarding this Mulk Raj Anand, when he ends up, his essay, The Sources of the Protest in my novel. He says, love takes the place of God, and as the defiance of all those offense, injury, deceits, lies, and murders of the body, soul becomes holy anger. So, in his words, his protest is the expression of his holy anger. So that is the theoretical lining which you perhaps can see here, that what go into the making of the protest literature, especially the prototype of protest literature, which we generally consider with regard to Mulkraj Anand's writing, his prose fiction, in comparison to the other writers, other Indian English writers who were writing at that time. Now, if this is not one example, there are multiple examples. So I'm just giving the random examples to discuss this issue. That when I read this, then this one particular quote from the Robin Jangom in the poetry in the time of terror, that extract also I really found very very sensible and very relevant here in this regard, because he wrote poetry, but then he also emphasized the same point which many of the protest writers and including Rukraj Anand has stated. He said that the poetry may be considered as a genre, as a form where we have some kind of romantic sensibility, where we perhaps would like to talk about the beautiful landscape, because Robin Jangom is from the northeast. So he says that when I write poem, people expect me to write about the beautiful landscape of the northeast, because it is such a wonderful place to look at. So there is some kind of anticipation of having beauty in the poetry, having some kind of the lyricism in the poetry and all. But then he says that when these northeast writers are writing amidst the terror, amidst the violence, how can you expect them just to write about the beauty of the landscape? I mean, that does not do justice with the writing itself. And so he titles his essay Poetry in the Time of Terror and states, my poetry seems to be drifting towards something more. It could not finish with the romantic sensibility. It could not finish with the versification only, because it had to have something more. And what is this? Living with menace of the gun, he cannot merely indulge in verbal wizardry or woolly aesthetic, but must perforce master the art of witness. The nobility of our craft will always be rooted into two commitments, which are, some writers find difficult to maintain, but that has to be there. And what it is? The refusal to be about what one knows and the resistance to the oppression. So that way, no writer can close the eyes to the reality which is there in the surrounding if he or she is a true writer. And then there is the resistance to the oppression that should come and that would come in the writing of the true protest writer. So he wrote this wonderful poem, Native Land, when he gave some idea about what kind of poetry would be coming from the times of terror. He writes, first came the scream of the dying in a bad dream, then the radio report and a newspaper, 6 shot dead, 25 houses razed, 16 beheaded with hands tied behind their backs inside a church. As the days crumbled and the victors and their victims grew in number, I hardened inside my thickening hide until I lost my timeless humanity. So you could see that what lies there in these words. As I said, prose is a weapon. So here the poetry also becomes a weapon for the same thing, because this is the poetry which is coming from the time of terror. So it cannot afford to deal just with the woolly aesthetics or the verbal wizardry, but it has to commit to the realities of life. It has to speak from the marginalized location. So this way you could find how the Northeast writers are trying to make to carve a niche in the mainstream writing and writing kind of poetry which is different and which is perhaps quite opposite to the anticipation. And that shows how the protest element percolates in literature, irrespective of the form, irrespective of the genre, whether prose and poetry. So even the poetry can also become a weapon, and you just need to sharpen it to get the desired impact. Now let's move from this native land, the issue of the native land, to the native son, because I said that protest literature is not bound with the boundaries. And again, I am picking up Richard Wright as an example here because he is one of the wonderful writers, great writers of the protest fiction in the African American tradition. Second thing, when we read him in the non-fictional prose, and even in his introduction to the Native Son, that is a great novel by him, he also talks about the sources of protest. And he also ends up with the same conclusion, the sources of the protest lies in life. I'll just read out. What did he say in his work, Introduction to the Native Son? I am not so pretentious as to imagine that it's possible for me to account completely for my own book. So it starts with a kind of disclaimer. He wrote it as an introduction to the novel Native Son. But I'm going to try to account for as much as of it as I can, the sources of it. So he is trying to hint where are the sources of this novel lie, because Native Son is one of the classic in terms of the protest literature or the protest fiction. So he says he would like to talk about the material that went into it, and he would like to talk about his own years long changing attitude towards that material. So, according to him, the writer comes to the conclusion that to account for his book is to account for his life. So, the book, the literature emerges out of the life and the sources of the protest, because the kind of book which he is talking about is the Native Son, where this black man is termed as the native son of America, and you find him in complete rage, who is, on war against the establishment, and who would do whatever he is forbidden to do. So this is the rebellious instinct that make that black man as a native son, which America need to fear, because if you keep on segregating blacks from white, then ultimately this would turn out into the form of a revolt. So this is the introduction to the Native Son, which is titled How Bigger Was Born. So this Bigger was basically the protagonist of the novel Native Son, and he is full of that anger, the holy anger, which Mukrat Anand also referred to in his theoretical discussion about the protest novel. So this Bigger Thomas is the name of the black protagonist of the novel Native Son. So in the introduction, which is titled How Bigger Was Born, writer Richard Wright is trying to investigate, and at the same time giving hints to the readership. He's addressing the reader and saying that this Bigger Thomas, the protagonist of Native Son, has not just come out of the blue. It's not like that in one day it is created. He says that it is coming out of my observations of my social surrounding. So he wrote, the birth of Bigger Thomas goes back to my childhood, and there was not just one Bigger, but many of them, more than I could count and more than you suspect. That common people, where you would find different characters, different types of people who would be responding to this racial discrimination in different ways. And so he actually enumerates, these imaginary characters who were caricatures of the real characters, or who are the representations of the real characters, or who are the symbols of the real characters. So he enumerates them that this Bigger Thomas is a prototype, and so you can have Bigger number 1, Bigger number 2, Bigger number 3, Bigger number 4, Bigger number 5, on all these Biggers put together creates this Bigger Thomas or Bigger Thomases, which is basically a prototype of the protest hero who would raise his voice against the racial discrimination. So what is the characteristic of these Bigger number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which Richard Wright, as a sensible soul, chanced to look at, which he came across in his journey of life? So who was the bigger one for him? He says that he saw a boy who terrorized him and all of the boys he played with. So he was a bully. But why was he a bully? Why he would do that? Because it would give him satisfaction to give an outlet to his, he knew he was wrong, but he would be doing it because he has so much anger, so much hatred in his mind, that he loses that humanity to a certain extent. So this Bigger number 2 was basically comparatively more mature, and his anger was not directed to his playmates, but his anger was directed towards the white who ruled the South. So this way he is channelizing his anger, maybe letting it out on his own playmates or letting it out on the white directly. And then there is another Bigger number 3, whom the white folks called a bad, quote unquote nigger. So this was the Bigger this was a kind of character which you could find in the American South, who would eat in the restaurant but would not pay. He is ready to break the law because he wanted the government establishment attention to himself, and he wanted to emphasize the point that how come you have these kind of Jim Crow laws there, where you have black house and white house and black graveyard and white graveyard and so on. So this way we have different kinds of Bigger whom Richard Wright witnessed in his real life. And so this Bigger number 4 was the one whose only law was death, and the Jim Crow laws of the South were not for him, because he would try to break this injudicious law which was segregating blacks from the white. And then began number five, who always rode in the Jim Crow streetcar without paying and sat wherever he pleased. So if he is forbidden to sit in that particular compartment which is reserved for white, you would find this bigger sitting in that compartment only and refusing to stand up, because that is his protest against the establishment, against this injudicious local system. And he is aware of the end. He knows the result, that what would be the end result of it. He might be hanged, maimed, lynched, and generally hounded until they were either dead or their spirits broken. So this is the way the Jim Crow laws would treat this rebellious bigger, but that bigger would not stop. He would definitely raise his voice, would definitely, you can say, break the law. So that is basically, the whole inspiration lying behind this protest hero, Bigger Thomas, in Richard Wright's native son. So this Bigger Thomas becomes a meaningful signifier. And so what Richard Wright makes very, very clear in his introduction, where he addresses the reader that what kind of fiction they are going to come across, what kind of hero they would come across. So he says that basically the you can say reason of it lies in the environmental factor. So there may be some role of the ideology here, because Richard Wright was also drifted towards the communist ideology, and he found it suitable for the black people also, because that communist ideology was talking about have and have nots, and would advocating the rights of the poor. So he could see some kind of parallel here between the poor class and between the class. So he committed to the ideology to some extent, but ultimately the sources of the protest, as he has pointed it out very well, that it lies in the real life. It's almost 11, so I'll just wind up my presentation. So Bigger Thomas becomes a prophetic symbol, and the sources of it lie in the environmental factors, the social conditioning, the outside society, the establishment, the wrongful judicial system, and the police system. So here lies that. So this way we move from the particular to general, and so we would like to, I would like to end this presentation with Richard Wright's quote in his introduction to Native Son, where he tries to identify this theoretical underlining. He says, the feeling of looking at things with a painful and unwarrantable nakedness was an experience. And that experience actually taught him. And what he learned, that this experience transcended national and racial boundaries. It was this intolerable sense of feeling and understanding so much, and yet living on a plane of social reality where the look of a world which one did not make or own struck one with a blinding objectivity and tangibility that made me grasp the revolutionary impulse in my life and the lives of those about me and far away. So this way he says that he came across with the multiple Bigger Thomases that perhaps inspired him to create Bigger Thomas, the black rebel, in his novel Native Son. And then he could see his parallel in a poor white also, who belong to the lower class or the poor class, where he is also tortured by the same establishment and all. And then he could find its parallel in the other literary streams also, that is basically transcending the national and the racial boundaries. And so he could see that no matter whatever is the location, if the social categorization is writ large with the power equation, and one section of the society uses, not only uses, in fact abuses the power for the subjugation of the other section, then the revolutionary impulse would emerge, then the protest would come out, then it would be articulated by the writers like Richard Wright, Nukraj Anand, Robin and Nangam, and many more. So that way, perhaps, we can come to the conclusion stating that the sources of the protest lies in the compulsion of life which these writers witness around them. Thank you so much.